you can only go for so long without drinking water, without that. I'm using ridiculous metaphors, but I'm going to go back and examine what I say and roll my eyes at myself.
That sounds like Paul Lisicky from the Wayback Machine. He of episode 27 fame. He is back with his new memoir. But first, CNF Pod is sponsored by Bay Path University's fully online MFA in creative nonfiction writing. Discover your story in Ireland, a destination renowned for its natural beauty and rich literary and musical history. Yes, this summer from August 1st to August 8th, study under such instructors as Mia Gallagher, Tommy Shea, and Ann Hood, and take your writing to that next level. There are reading groups, tea and talk, and also get outdoors in one of the most beautiful places on earth. Visit baypath.edu/MFA for more information. Well, here's a quote to chew on from George Herman Ruth, otherwise known as Babe Ruth. Quote, "Never let the fear of striking out keep you from playing the game," end quote. Ugh, that's so lame. I mean, it's true, but it's so rote. How about, never let the fear of striking out keep you from riff. I don't know about you, but it's much better, right? Hey, Paul Lisicky is here. So stoked. His latest memoir, Later, My Life at the Edge of the World by Greyhouse. Greyhouse? It's not even a publishing. Oh my god. Graywolf Press is incredible. I know the year is young, but it's the best book I've read this year. It's a frontrunner for the CNF Pod Book Award for Outstanding Achievement in the Field of Excellence. Oh, hey, by the way, it's the Creative Nonfiction Podcast. I'm your host, Brendan O'Mara. Hey. This is the show where I talk to badass writers, filmmakers, memoirists, narrative journalists about the art and craft of telling true stories, where I kind of try to tease out some origins and some tactical things so you can get a little bit better at your own work. And that award for outstanding achievement in the field of excellence, it's going to be a real thing. I mean, why not? But it's also a Simpsons deep cut. Go look for it. It's pretty funny. But I'm serious. It's a killer book. Later is an awesome book. My favorite kind of memoir. It's the kind that drills down on a time so perfectly with such focus. It's inspired me to dive into this project I have called The Last Summer or The Final Summer, about my time in Lake Placid in the early 2000s. It's 3 summers I spent there. And it was about, the whole thing is just about summer ending forever, summer as we know it. That time when there was no ambition, you just kind of work hard at your day job. Mine was waiting tables and so forth, and I loved it. And I think per hour, it's probably the best paying job I've ever had, and I kind of like it, and I probably should do it again because it probably pays better than what I'm doing now. Live in that moment, no career, can you get the girl, all that stuff. Trust me, plenty of unsavory shit, unbecoming of a decent, well-adjusted human, but Paul's book gives me the ticket to go for it. I mean, that should tell you how good that book is, right? Trust me. Graywolf Press, and the book is called Later. Hey, here's another review from Apple Pods worth reading. If you leave a kind review, I'll be sure to read it on the air. It means a lot to the show to get them, and I want to show my appreciation for you by giving the best of shout-outs here in the intro. It's from Bill, and his last name is part of his Apple handle, but I'll leave that off. All right, each episode has a unique personality. Quote, I first checked out the CNF podcast a while back when I somehow heard about the interview with Laura Hillenbrand. I'm sure she's been interviewed a zillion times, but you could really hear her enthusiasm as Brendan drew her out of her love for researching and interviewing in particular. I've now listened to about 24 episodes, hopefully more by now. That's just me. Obviously, the guests are different, but I appreciate how Brendan adapts his questions and questioning style to each guest. Each show has an absolutely unique, quote, personality. As someone who writes while working another job, I also admire Brendan's hustle in the best possible meaning in airing this podcast every week. It's a welcome source of inspiration and ideas and of review. Bill, that's amazing. Thank you so much. That's why we do this show, baby. I love it. Keep it coming. Head over to Apple Podcasts and do the thing. Hey, also, do you know that registration is open for HippoCamp 2020? The early birds are gone, but there's still a way to save some dough. Visit hippocamp2020.hippocampusmagazine.com or just Google HippoCamp 2020 if you don't want to type all that in. And use the promo code CNFPOD 2020 to get $40 off your fee for this conference. It's from August 14th to August 16th. And I know for a fact I'm going to use the promo code if I just get off my ass and register. Best money you'll spend on a conference this year, I promise you. And that $40 can go towards buying books at the little book fair. There's going to be stuff from the keynotes. There's going to be all sorts of goodies there. And you can buy like probably 3, 4, maybe like 3 or 4 books. That's amazing. Or go to the bar. In any case, also one more thing in terms of sponsor things. Hey, we all need editors. We all need editing, and especially accountability. If you've got an essay or a book that needs coaching, I'd be honored and thrilled, seriously, to serve you in your work. Email me at brendan@brendanomeara.com. Hey. And let's start a conversation because the world needs your work. We need you to show up, and I want to be there to help you out. Also, show notes and the monthly newsletter are, of course, are at the website, brendanomeara.com. Follow along social channels if you'd like, at CNFPod, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. All right. It's high time for you to hear one of my favorite writers, one of my favorite guests. Paul came to play ball, and this episode will not disappoint. You ready? Let's do this. Huh. Awesome. I was looking through the backlog of episodes, and you were, episode 27, and almost 4 years ago. It was like October of 2016 when we talked about the narrow door.
Right. It's amazing that, that 2016 feels like lifetimes ago.
Oh, I know. I mean, so much has happened, and so much is just like worn at our collective psyche in the last 4 years.
Right.
Oh man! But how have you been? How's it going?
I think well. Yeah. It's a busy time is ahead, and the book is actually coming out this week at AWP. So. It's not officially out till the 17th, but yeah, this just feels like I'm on the verge of a big marker, and it's going to be a relief to be in it rather than to keep anticipating it.
Oh yeah, oh for sure. And is there are you finding that there's any kind of kind of fun riding the wave, or you just want this thing to come, you just want to get this in motion and start the next phase of this process?
There actually is fun riding the wave. And I mean, I think for me, it's hard to anticipate it from a month out when when reviews haven't come in, and, you start second guessing every move you've made and thinking about all the possible people whom you've offended, and et cetera, et cetera. It's just generalized anxiety that that focuses on the book. So it feels a lot better now.
Excellent.
I think I can put my anxiety toward the coronavirus.
Right.
Like everyone else appears to be doing right now.
Exactly. Nice. Oh, cool. Well, the book, I read it this week. It's been on my shelf for several weeks, and I've just been like itching to get to start reading it because I having enjoyed The Narrow Door as much as I did, and then when this came out, I was just like, oh, I'm like was so excited to get into it, and it didn't disappoint. This was such a good memoir.
Thank you. Do you feel like, I mean, is it okay if I ask you a question, a quick one? Does it feel substantially different from the previous book? I mean, it's hard for me to think of the two in connection to each other.
It's funny. I had only read Narrow Door once, and it was 4 years ago, so I had a hard time. I can't make that much of a connection in terms of
right.
But
what it wasn't meant to be a technical, it wasn't meant to be a loaded question at all. I'm just curious about the experience of one book up against the next to a reader.
Right. But from what I recall of that one, of course, it does feel of of an author's body of work, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like it
Sure.
they play well together. That they're of the same voice and mind, even though it's
right.
One was far more current, and this one goes back 30 years.
Yeah, you're exactly. Yeah.
But no, it was both were, I enjoyed both tremendously, and this one being the most recent one. What I particularly loved about it too, and what I love about memoirs of this nature, is that it focuses in so tightly on one particular period of time, and I love memoirs like that, and that's what I was one of the many draws of this as I was reading it.
Thanks so much.
This story too, I mean, it's in a sense, it's like you've been with it for 30 years. So what about it? What about it made you want to take it on at this point?
Yeah, I started it about 4 or 5 weeks after my father died, and I think I needed some container for all of that complicated feeling, and I wasn't able to write about my father directly. But honestly, the story of those early years in Provincetown have been present with me for decades in a way that other periods of my life haven't been. And I try to write about that particular era in other forms. There's an early novel version of it that I wrote in my 30s, which just I abandoned. And then there are other versions of the story there's a small version of the story in my book, Famous Builder. But I knew that I needed a larger canvas, and I just happened to be lucky enough to be at an artist colony at in this period, and I just it was before The Narrow Door came out, so this was 2015, and I gave myself permission to explore and play and to be bad if need be. I mean, it was possible that I was going to put this side yet again and I wouldn't be satisfied. But I think it was the confluence, sounds like a pretentious word, but it was the confluence of my father's death and this particular artist residency that I had that managed to keep me settled and focused on this particular period.
And going back to our conversation from a few years ago, I was just kind of looking at a couple of the pull quotes from the show notes of that, and you had said what would it be like to be an amateur again?
Oh, wow. That's my old line. Yeah.
I was just like, that's great. And it's kind of speaking to that, how you wanted to find a sense of play to approach the story.
Right. I mean, the earliest version of this book was in past tense, and it was fairly linear. And I was excited by the fact that it felt straightforward and readerly, because, one of the concerns I've had about other books of mine is that, the structural fluidity puts some readers off. So I had a fairly straightforward book, and I came to a point where it did not feel like it honored the complexity of that time. And I put it away for a while and, was disappointed that the book I'd written ended up feeling too neat and resolved. It felt like it was arching toward a kind of order that wasn't true to my own experience and the experience of many people I know. So I went back a year later and started pulling it apart. I wanted some of it to be a narrative time, but I thought, oh, there are places here that could live in a kind of poetic time. I mean, there are opportunities here to write prose poems, even though I don't use that word, into the material to complicate its sense of forwardness. I also flipped it into the present because I think the book needed a kind of immediacy. And one of the things that it hadn't done in the prior draft was that it felt a little too distant and wise. And, ironically, I think I needed to write this material in an immediate way in order to push it back into the past.
Yeah, and you probably couldn't approach that having not, sat with it in writing, the first, the first raw, stab at it, the first audition of this book, and then having
Right.
tabled it and then coming back to it. It's there's
Yeah.
something to be said for, just muscling through some iteration, so you can then start shaping it into, a form that's more, just more congruent with what's your current vision of it.
Oh, exactly. And I think, when after there is that temporal distance, it's like it feels more like an object. It's kind of not yours anymore. You're a different person. So I always think of it like, I'm stripping the finish off a piece of old furniture, and it doesn't matter if I make a mess. Like it stops feeling so precious and concretized on the sentence by sentence level.
Yeah, so much of this. I pulled out so many great passages that I want to unpack, and I think something you just said, kind of about the technical aspects of it, and how you would put it aside for a bit and then came back to it. There was a moment in the book too where you were at a reading in town from a novel that you say called Bad Florida, but a novel you said you soon put aside for good. And sort of a question I had about that is, like, when do you decide to give up on projects versus tabling them indefinitely? And it looks like Later was tabled for a time, and you're like, yes, I do need to come back to this with a different set of skills.
That's a great question. I think I put that first novel aside because after a year, after a year of being out of grad school, out of my MFA program, I was aware that I don't know. I developed a different set of aesthetics, and the book I'd written was uh, so bent toward em- emphasizing connectivity and control and coherence. It was really well behaved. And I knew it was a book that probably would have done okay if I'd presented sections of it in workshop. But it felt structurally out of sync with what I was learning. I mean, I moved to Provincetown, and Provincetown back then was a haven for people with HIV and AIDS. And I was there as a fellow at the Fine Arts Work Center and was just quite aware of it was impossible not to be aware of the extremity in town. I mean, there was a convivial everyday surface to how people interacted with one another, but death wasn't a theory. Death was something, it was the house you walked past or the apartment you were heading toward. And I think all of that intensity um, led me to reconceive my work around a kind of structure that was much more fragmentary, that felt closer to my true way of seeing. And I knew it was the kind of work that probably would have been, I don't know, dismissed by my MFA classmates as much as I respected their opinions. But I think I was finding a form that felt truer to who I was.
And with respect to the fragmented nature of how you compose the book and the chapters and everything and the micro chapters within each chapter, like how did and the immediacy of it all too. What was it? What was that like for you, having written it past tense and then having sort of that distance, and then maybe like flipping the script and making it immediate? Like, what did it really conjure the memories in a more vivid way, and did it really put you back there in a way that in a way that could almost be scary?
Yeah, it initially felt super awkward to me. I mean, I thought, this might not work. And I would look at a reconceived chapter and read it aloud, and then read it aloud in past tense. And I'd say, oh, the past tense is so much better. But I'd lived with the tentativeness of it all for a while. And gradually it felt like the book taught me what it wanted to be. And I think I just needed to learn to sit with the temporal shifts and the shifts in voice that this new structure had been suggesting. And it after a couple of years, it felt okay. This feels as true as I can get it, as emotionally accurate as it was to be in those times.
You alluded to it in that death was this house you walked by, and it's always this undercurrent. The HIV and the AIDS epidemic of that time, and the fear that's always alongside you is also something that, at least through my interpretation of the book, is also something that makes you guys and makes everyone in your community really kind of feel alive and drawn together as well. Like, this is kind
absolutely.
And so maybe give us a sense of that, and like kind of take us to that, how living with that fear actually kind of gave you a sense of life too.
Yeah, it would just, that sense of life that, it came up out of nowhere. This was a scene that I never put in the book. I have a memory of being in the Provincetown gym, which was this shambly little place with broken equipment right on the water. And it felt like everyone, or at least all the cool people, the artists in town, came to the gym at around 4 p.m. And the woman who ran it said, she stopped everything and she barked out in a military voice, "Someone smells in here." and it was at first really horrifying because it came down with such intensity, but we never found out who was bothering her. But I just remember everyone, male and female, straight and queer, smelling each other and making jokes for about an hour. It was like a legendary moment, and it was so sweet. And I think it was the kind of experience that only would have happened in a place that was at that time being forged by a health emergency. It didn't, there's something about that health emergency that ended up, you're probably hearing sirens outside.
A little bit, yeah, that's fine.
Leveling hierarchy in a lot of ways. So that was one of the loveliest qualities of that time. I mean, I felt like people felt a need to check in on one another, if only simply to say hi at the grocery store or at town hall or whatever public place in town. It just, I felt like people were attuned to one another, whether they were known to be HIV positive or not. It was a terrific sense of participation at that particular point in time. And I don't mean to idealize, because I'm sure plenty of people hated each other, and there were enemies, as there are always enemies and cliques and human social relationships, but by and large it was an incredibly welcoming time. And I know along with many other people, needed the energy of all that to get us through complicated days.
And there's a point where you write where we're all going to die anyway, and I'm tired of living on the outside, and then I'm afraid of never moving into my life. And
right.
Kind of take us to the sentiment of that, having come to town, and that's kind of something that's bubbling underneath your surface.
Right. I'd kept my light pretty low throughout much of my 20s. I mean, I'd lived in Florida, I'd lived in New Jersey, I'd lived in Iowa, and in all those places, I'd gotten the sense that in order to exist as a gay man, I'd have to, I don't know how to say it. I just said keep my light low, but just keep a low profile, kind of blend in. Not make a big statement of myself. I mean, I know there are people who live in those environments who do the opposite and make like outside statements of themselves. But I was aware that, that self-subduing was having a cost on me. And there was something terrifically enlivening about moving to a place where queerness wasn't on the outskirts, it wasn't marginal, but it was the dominant culture. And I felt that shift into my body during my first walk in town. I was aware of my shoulders falling back and holding my chin up and standing differently and sort of claiming myself in a physical way that I'd never had before. And, I really didn't know what I was missing until I entered a space that felt, safe and energizing and inclusive.
And it's like you don't have to tiptoe around anymore, and you can fully step into your own skin.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us know what it's like to be in certain parts of our lives a part of a culture where you think, oh, I've found my people. So I felt like I found my people, but I also found my town, because this was a town where I could both be a writer / artist, but I could also be an LGBT person. And there really weren't that many places where that, where those two aims could be so compatible, unless, say, you lived in New York or another big city. And I don't think, in my late 20s and early 30s, I had the confidence or the will to make a lot of money in order to live in a place like this. So, it was the right place for me at that time. But as I say it, it fills me with melancholy given what was happening then.
Right. Yeah. Because it was, I think you're right too, that with death always in the air, death was always in the air, and there was something you referred to about intimacy. And it made me wonder if with death always being in the air, was intimacy all the more dangerous?
Probably so. And yeah, it felt like there might have been more of an imperative to go there, even though, I think for many people, in order to survive that experience, had to enclose themselves and build up walls and refused to feel, because if once they started, they'd crumble. I mean, I read some statistics or some stories about some of the nurses in town who talk about shoring themselves up in a way that almost felt inhuman, because they knew that it would be the end of them if they started mourning, Tom or Kenny or whoever they lost within a period of 2 weeks.
Yeah, you also it sort of piggybacking off of that too. You write that, but anyone who's ever had sex knows that sex has a life all its own, and that's true if you're straight or queer. And it's just like that's that overpowering thing where you just say like fuck it and throw care to the wind, and that's
I mean, it's like, it's eating your food, it's like taking care of yourself, drinking water, it's listening to music. It's just part of one of the essentials that keep us alive. And you can only go for so long without drinking water, and without that. I'm using ridiculous metaphors, but I'm gonna go back and examine what I say and roll my eyes at myself. But it's, like sex is not, especially in those times, like felt, it felt like an act of rebelliousness and subversion, and central to claiming one's identity.
Yeah, and within that context as well, like part of what you write too, in a time of barriers, skin to skin feels transgressive, close, and alive. And I think this piggybacked off a micro scene where you were seeing some of the older men, maybe in their 40s or 50s at the time, and it was just something like, maybe they didn't take the risks that we have the courage to take.
Yeah, maybe so. Who knows? Yeah. I mean, there were so few men in that town who made it past 40.
Yeah.
That's the astonishing thing. I mean, it's hard to conceive of a place like that now, where a large segment of the population wasn't from their 20s to 40s. And so it was hard to conceive of futurity if you realize, there weren't role models in the air. There weren't the possibility of friendships with people who were 45, which is, I mean, the irony right now is that Provincetown's a place where most people are 55 and over. I mean, most of the people who live there, and like Palm Springs and some other, Fort Lauderdale, they're or even the Castro, most of the people who live in those places tend to be older.
Yeah, and there's lots of characters that come into this book, and one who comes in, kind of briefly about halfway through, and is Lucy, and I just kind of thought she was kind of charming, and with the confidence with which she comes into the story, and I was wondering, maybe you can talk about Lucy and the way she parachuted into your life.
Yeah, she, instantly had a presence. And I still remember that scene out on the parking lot at the Fine Arts Work Center where, she came up to the poet Tim Siebels and I and pretty much announced herself and like let us know that she was here and she was someone to know. And I mean, there had been a lot of buzz about Lucy because she had already sold the manuscript for the manuscript that would be what's Lucy's book title? I'm blanking out. The autobiography of my face, before she came to the work center, and that book was sold for, at that time, a substantial amount of money. So she had a kind of shimmer and glow about her. We knew she was going to be a star, and she did too. And she had a lot of energy, and she was funny, and she made you feel like you were her best friend when you were in her presence. And at the same time, she also knew how to push your buttons and to, you know, to be, to to be a bit, what's the word? Tetchy? Is that the right word? Just to kind of poke a little bit to see how you would react. And I think for Lucy, that might have been a way into intimacy. She was not one of those people who is so much interested in maintaining a friendship of calmness and equilibrium. I mean, she liked a friendship that had a little pushback in it. And yeah, I think people fell in love with her because of that, because you felt like you were being taken seriously and challenged. And I mean, I think plenty of my memories around Lucy are vaguely exasperated, but I hope that that exasperation is just, expressed. It's another expression of love, I think.
Yeah. Was there ever any, knowing that this rising star is coming in with a huge book advance, what was the feeling among the other writers around town who were just like, come on, really? You've got this giant advance and here we are, like, scraping by.
I wish I could, this sounds, I don't mean to sound Pollyanna. I don't remember people feeling jealous of her. Maybe because we knew that to write such a book would be a very difficult project. And, to bear up against a big advance is always tough. Like she had a responsibility and it wasn't easy. And she never made it seem like sitting down with that book came easily at all. I mean, I think I'm positive she tried to avoid writing that material as much as she can and looked for every opportunity to take her away from her desk. So yeah, I don't remember, I might have excised, anyone's jealousy out of that story. I mean, there were also, one person I remember who was a fellow during that year was Matt Clam, or the writer Matthew Clam, who got into the New Yorker maybe a few months before the end of the fellowship. And that felt exciting because he sent that piece unsolicited, and Dan Menaker, or whoever was the editor then, just took it out of the slush pile. So he didn't tell us about that with any sense of entitlement. He was in awe and confused and excited and scared, and wanted to tell his colleagues, his pals, his buddies around us. So I'm sure there's always competition in the air when in a group of artists who all want the same thing. But honestly, I think we were all audacious enough to think, well, if Lucy could get that, or if Matt can get that, I could get it too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great abundant mindset to take, that like if you see the success of others, that it's not some zero-sum game, like, oh shoot, like that's
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and too many people have that wiring, and I think if there's, I don't know if it's possible to correct or fix that wiring, but it's disabling. If someone else, your buddy, comes into success or good reviews or appreciation, why not? Yeah, why not think that, hey, he can do it, I can do it as well.
And in the book too, I love how the smallest apartment in the world, and I love this little place. Of just trying to envision how tiny it is was like an exercise in my own imagination. It was crazy, and it was. It also comes in a book too, where you, I think the world is kind of shrinking around you as well, or you're retreating just a little bit. You're more settled, and trying to get some work done, and you're just having been there, you're like, okay, as you settle into a new place, you can afford to retreat a bit. So this apartment kind of felt to me like, oh, this is Paul's way of kind of claiming a little a space of his own, but also away from everybody else. And I'm wondering maybe you could speak to that.
Well, I think that the very particular small apartment just felt like a negotiation with more precarious financial standards, because that came right after my two subsequent fellowships. And Provincetown is a super expensive place now, but it was much less expensive then. And it took a lot of work to find a little place. First, you had to know someone in town and get, verbal references from a friend, but they also required maybe the full summer's rent by May 15th, at a time when no one was making any money in town, because the town back then was full of flakes, and people would just say, I'm not into this, and depart. And a lot of rents were verbal rather than written down. So yeah, I think that particular move is about, making do with the fact that my life might be a little less luxurious. Financially, this is going to be harder to do, but it's a way to stay in town, which is nourishing me, and it's a way to continue working on my writing.
Right, and I think you're right that it was something like 6 feet by 6 feet. Was that the actual dimension?
One of these days, I know that building, and I've been inside, and I'd be curious about measuring it, but I really think it's about 6 feet by 6 feet. It was enough to hold a single bed, a really narrow desk. There wasn't a closet. There was a tiny strip of kitchen figures with a kind of toy dorm refrigerator beneath the sink, and it had a shower stall, and and the other things we have in a bathroom, but it was about as austere as it could get. It's like something you would give a nut on a priest, or a priest in some seaside monastery or convent. But it had the most amazing view on the other side of a staircase, but it was still an amazing view of the harbor, and there was something tremendously enlivening about that, like seeing the day change over the water.
Something I want to ask you too is every chapter, maybe every other chapter or so, like you use kind of like your mother as a grace note every so often, and I was wondering like how you chose to want to like sort of drop in a little thing, a conversation you had with your mother, or it's something illustrative of the relationship with your mother, like every so often, and it's spaced out. Yeah. It seems like strategically. And I was wondering what was the approach there.
I think I was aware on some level of how precarious my time in this place was. It felt like I'd entered the place that I'd finally found my world, but I knew that that was not to be taken for granted. And I knew there was the pressure of another world always bearing up on me. And it was, the pressure of, my parents' own complicated relationship. They seem to, I don't know, they seem to need their children for their complicated relationship. I know there's a long, long story behind that. Like they needed us as characters, but they wanted. My father was always trying to get me to come back home, and I had grown up in a family in which, art and achievement and drive was encouraged, but I think only to a degree. And they were so afraid of losing me in multiple ways. And it seemed important to enact that pressure on my everyday life. Because I think, aside from the dread of illness being an obstacle, it also the all the complexity of family life needed to be a part of the equation as well, because I didn't it hurt that my leaving hurt my parents.
Yeah.
And it's still, when my parents are no longer around, and even when I summon it up now, it just like throws me into this this position of bewilderment. I don't know why it was difficult for for my parents' children to leave. I mean, I think it was probably related to the cultures in which they grew up. You stayed close by. Your primary your primary task was to be tied in some way to your family.
Right. Yeah. That's These days, like families are so disparate and fractured,
Right.
geographically.
Yeah.
But yeah, it can be really hard for people who didn't move, let's say, more than say 20 radius of 20 miles outside of their hometowns, and when they get sick, it's like the kids will take care of them, and then someone else, like that whole lineage, will just manifest itself. But
Exactly. Yeah. And I think in part, my mom had a really rough childhood, had suffered some serious losses and trauma. And, in I think one of the projects of her life was to look like she wasn't hurt to other people. And it was really important that we look as a family like uh, we're all okay and successful and a model group of people. And yeah, the team of us together seemed really imperative. And it was pretty clear that that was unsustainable. And so the drama of that was ongoing behind my time in Provincetown. It would be a much different story if I simply moved there and came into my own and didn't think about my parents, even though HIV was in the atmosphere. It would not be true to the experience of those times for me.
did you get a sense that even though parents of course want their kids to be successful, but success sometimes means that they will go far away, and that
Exactly.
yeah, and then during this time, of course, of course, in this fellowship, you get it for a consecutive year, which is very rare and very validating in terms of your writing and the trajectory of your career. But did you ever get a sense that your parents were, or did you feel a pressure that maybe that they were hoping that you would fail because failure would mean you would come home?
Oh, you might be right. I never voiced that to myself, but yeah, if the failure would have to be coupled with the look of achievement somehow. That's the only. I don't know what that could be. It would those two things would have to be concurrent.
Right.
And then the math would be all right, and yeah.
Yeah, and there's parts too where you write, as you're getting more, more settled and more among, this, having found your people, as you say, you write that what's boredom but invisibility, power, the freedom to move among strangers without anyone making a target of you. Isn't that what I want to do? What I wanted to, and I don't know. I
Yeah.
just wondered if you could speak to that as well, because that seems like it's it's something that you want, but also you struggled with that.
Right. Well, and certainly true for I think in that particular part of the book, that's my mother's goal as well. And Yeah, I mean, what would it mean to be, a part of a world in which your, your flaws or your idiosyncrasy were not were not the defining marks of you? I mean, what would it be like if those qualities were simply Paul? I think that's what I think that's what I was trying to evoke in that space.
And you were, you were kind of talking around, success and failure and ambition too, and sort of that achievement that your father was always striving for as well. And I wonder what your relationship is to ambition and and drive and achievement
Yeah,
in the arts and in your career now. Like, what's your,
yeah.
what are your relationship to that at this point in your writing career?
That's a great question because I like those words make me so uncomfortable because I can't help but associate them with capitalism and all of the qualities about our current times that make me really nervous. But those ambition, aspiration, all of that keeps showing up in my work. I mean, it's all the way back to Famous Builder. And yeah, I mean, I think those forces can help us, do our best in our work and help us like, you know, push our work into places we wouldn't have expected and to have um, high goals for what it should be. But I think the danger is that um, one is participating in a kind of hierarchy of currency or value, if that makes sense. And I think part of my own uh, artistic career has been an attempt at the same time to write what I need to write and not write better than my friend Tom, but to write at the very best thing that, like, to write that in a way that sounds like me, to like turn my own liabilities, as some would say, into assets, to make use of my interest in disjunction and tonal shift and do it in such a way that it didn't feel indulgent or sloppy, but to make it sound exactly like me. So I guess ambition is sort of an ugly word, but and I remember my therapist telling me 10 years ago, and I was talking about, I used the word competition. He said, Paul, it's not a bad thing. I would never have gotten my PhD if so and so did not finish his dissertation before I did. And he was trying to teach me to be friends with that impulse in myself and to find a way to manage it so that it didn't dominate me.
Mm. Yeah, and in my conversation a week ago with Alexander Norman, this guy wrote a biography on the Dalai Lama, and
Oh,
he
cool.
and yeah, he was talking about for the last 30 years he's been really it's an ongoing challenge for him to find his voice as a writer, and it's
Yeah.
kind of refreshing for someone who's been in it for so long to actually still be having that struggle.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, and the fact that you say, trying to, find that tone of the writing that sounds like you, I wonder, like, at what point did you start to feel comfortable in your own writerly voice, or is that still evolving?
I think it's still evolving. I don't want to rely on the same voice from book to book, which is probably why I asked you that question from the get go. Does that sound different? And I think I was hoping you'd say yes, but um, I mean that can be that the desire to shift can. I mean, I think it's possible that can be fake and engineered and you know and done for its own sake. We all change in time. I'm a different person now from the person I was when The Narrow Door came out. I mean, we're all different, given the multiple crises in the air. And I think the trick is to, to be attuned to how you've changed, and to the descriptions and music that feel, most authentic to how you move through the world at any point. But so yeah, I mean, I would really love to do something with the next book that surprised me, that did something different in terms of sound and structure, or thinking that sounded like nothing I've done before, but might also suggest, oh, this is just another mind with a particular set of terms moving and morphing across time.
I think it's all the more important that when you embark on a book project that you actually have to have a sense of urgency to finish it, because
Right.
like the writer you are at the beginning, if you take too long, might be way different than you are towards the end.
Absolutely, and that you probably should be, because
Yeah.
I mean the work is teaching you something about your seeing and your patterns and obsessions and what you want. So yeah, the question of why am I writing this? Why do I need to write this? Needs at some point to be, it's abstract, but it needs to like reside somewhere above your work. If only as a way to find your rudder.
Mm. And with respect to this book, and it's something like we were talking about that you've carried with you for a long time, and I'm going back to another thing you said from our previous conversation, where you said if you put too much focus on one thing, you can kill it. And
interesting.
It's such
pretty smart,
and it's great. It's brilliant.
I forgot about that.
Yeah, and this is something that is so hyper focused and hyper, local to that time. That what was your relationship to the focus, and how did you not kill the thing you were trying to
Right.
bring into being?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, early on, I'd say in the first third of the books, there are a number of passages from other figures, whether they be queer theorists or townies. There's Holland Cotter, the art critic. I wanted to, like, the early parts of the book to have a choral effect. I didn't want the I to be too dominant. I was uncomfortable with it being simply my story, and I wanted it to be a community story, or the story of a sensibility. And that certainly helped a lot. It helped to bring, I think there's a wider net of characters on the page in this book. Some of them only appear on a half page, but I wanted to give room to, to do as much as I could to at least imply that I was part of a large community of various individuals who had very distinct personalities of their own.
Mm. Yeah, you do get that sense that all these people kind of zooming in, zooming out, that it was just an incredibly vibrant community. Everyone's got their their lives and their bullshit, and their drive and their art and everything, and here you are just in the slurry of it all, so that does come across very well.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, everyone sort of stood out like a character. It felt like everyone had a persona, and it's hard to actually, evoke how that played out. I mean, it wasn't simply about how people dressed, but I felt like I was as part of a theater, and all these people were acting, and I don't mean to suggest that people were not being themselves or authentic, but there was a sense of the liberation of the mask, if that makes sense. Like, uh, uh, yeah, I like a determined building of character that helped you move your way through town, that helped you be seen.
Yeah, and it might not even be uh, so much maybe a building of character, but more of a revealing of character. Given that this is
Yeah.
finally an area where you don't have to be so. It can be more out in the open.
Yeah, I mean, and you didn't necessarily have to be so reactive, but you could make something. You could build a personality and
Yeah.
change your name, for instance, and come to this place without a history and without the burden of prior stories weighing who you were down.
Yeah, it's kind of like going to college again for the first time, where you can kind of.
It's true.
I wonder too, like in the writing, as we kind of wind down here, was there ever a danger in glorifying coming out of town during the height of the AIDS epidemic? Because you write towards the very end of the book, like, quote, note, AIDS isn't the good old days.
Right. Yeah, I did not want the book to be soaked in nostalgia.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I didn't want the book to overemphasize the sense of, community and tenderness and belonging that was certainly there, because that feels that doesn't feel altogether true to me, and I think that narrative is a little problematic. Um, so I wanted the book to have enough of a sense of chaos and uncertainty that would, if not upend that, like live side by side with that. So the book moves to a point where the speaker simply says, representation is impossible. And if you try to think you can do this, well, if you think you have the story, I've got this, you're wrong. And yeah, I think that's a point of, just a point of humility in the book. There's probably a better word than humility, but speechlessness.
And also in a section titled "Refusal," you write it's not about getting tested for HIV. It has lots to do with, like, what good is knowing if we're all going to die, or that there are all kinds of suicides. And
Right.
And then you write of dread too. So I was wondering how did you come to live with that dread and holding it back, as you say?
Yeah, I don't know if I did a very good job of holding it back. I mean, I did not get tested for HIV until some point in the aughts, because I didn't want to know the news. I didn't want it to impact my relation to the future. I didn't want it to be the primary story of me. And I know that sounds irresponsible at this point, but there was no guarantee that the drugs that were then available were going to sustain anyone for any more than a few years. So, yeah, I remember that dread, that anxiety I remember just slipping into that every day. At least it would just come out of nowhere, as, any anxiety comes out of nowhere, and you sit with it and you take it as long as you can take it and move on, but it was not, it was ongoing. And Yeah. Yeah. It just felt after a while like the texture of life.
Mm.
I mean, we could certainly, I mean, think of how many people are, there's no, it seems unfair and simplistic to compare AIDS anxiety to what people are talking about around the coronavirus. But, there's a lot of, there's something about that anxiety around a disease, an illness that could possibly go out of control. That seems, it's like what people do when we're confronted with the fact that we really can't control our mortality as much as we think we're controlling it.
Mm. Well, very nice. Well, Paul, I want to be mindful of your time. I just, this book is, it's an incredible memoir. I loved it.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, ate it up. I just,
Great.
I wish you great success with it.
Thanks so much.
Of course.
Yeah,
where can, where can people get more familiar with you and your work, and of course, pick up this book?
You can look at my website, which is PaulLisicky.net for lots of information, but you can pre-order the book now through all the book channels that are available to us. I have a link on my website to IndieBound, I think it's important that we keep our independent bookstores in mind. So it'll be out in the world in a couple of weeks. So I would really appreciate it if you took a look at it.
Awesome. Well, Paul, yeah, like I said, best of luck with it, and thanks again for the time. I'm glad we were able to do this again, and hopefully not another 4 years will go by.
Yeah, I hope not either. Thanks so much, Brent.
We did it. We made it, CNFers. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure you're subscribing to the show, of course. This crazy show is produced by me, Brendan O'Mara. Hey. I make the show for you. I hope it made something worth sharing. And if you really dig the show, leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Show notes are at BrendanO'Mara.com. Follow the show on the various social media channels at CNFPod across them all. Get that newsletter at my website. Win books, win zines, hang out with your buddy B.O. Once a month, no spam, can't beat it. Are we done here? We must. Because if you can't do interviews, see ya!